We have a remarkable panel here, and what I imagine is going to be a really terrific conversation that we're going to have, and we're going to try to get to the audience as quickly as possible as well. This panel and discussion is about the politics of responding to a crisis, the politics of the bailout. And I want to start, if I could, with the mayor, who wasn't the mayor at the time. And I want to think about TARP for a second. I want to think about TARP 2008, but I want to ask you this political question about the world we live in today. And we will go back 5 years, I'm sure. But if you could pretend, unfortunately, that we were in the soup all over again, that we were in the midst of this financial crisis, given the shifts in Washington, the shifts potentially in the polarization of the country, if you believe that, my question is whether you believe Congress, the Senate, the President today would have been able to pass something like TARP. No.
Let me, no is the headline answer, but let me give the reason why and walk you through. And that's a small N no, not a big N no. And I don't think this is fully appreciated at the time, and I still don't think it's fully appreciated now. Think about this if you put the context. First of all, when Hank Paulson and Ben Bernanke and Commissioner Cox came up to the Hill and to Nancy's office, you're 2 months, since you asked political, not financial, you're 2 months before a presidential election. You are 2 months before the entire House of Representatives up, which is what happens every 2 years. And then you're obviously a third of the United States Senate, not counting gubernatorial and state house races. And given all the feelings that was happening pre that going in for the last 7 years, I think people underappreciate the way that the Democratic Congress at that time responded to the national crisis. We didn't say, hey, this is your problem, your fault. We got told we got 48 hours to deliver $750 billion to the banks, no questions asked, no rules written. And while we worked through that issue, we stood up our responsibility to the country, regardless of a looming election. The entire judgment and the entire jacket could have been put on the president and the other party. And we did our job. And I don't think the Congress today, under the stewardship of the leadership, and this is not to make a partisan point, although they just gave you a lot of, well, I could make a lot more partisan point if you like. So you can snicker, but if the last 2 weeks haven't taught you anything, I got a bridge over the Tigris River you could buy.
I appreciate your understanding.
Yeah. So my point is, I don't think that, and I remind everybody is, when the TARP got voted on, the first time it went down because of the Republican, what happened with the Republican votes at that time. They didn't stand behind George Bush. So you ask me whether this crowd would be more understanding of a financial crisis than the crowd that voted down the TARP the first time? The answer is no.
Senator?
Well, I know there's great danger in disagreeing with the mayor in Chicago.
Your flight is now canceled. Come spend some more money here.
Life expectancy has taken on a different meaning for me. But
that drive to over here is going to be long.
I have to nuance his answer because I honestly believe that most of the tension and the dysfunction we're seeing in Washington, which is, in my opinion, inexcusable at many levels, is artificially driven today. The crises are artificially driven, they're politically created. This was a real crisis. This was as deep and as serious an event as the Congress has faced in my lifetime. And the language which was used by Secretary Paulson and Chairman Bernanke when they came up and briefed the negotiating teams on that Thursday night was stark. And I think there was a willingness right at that point to put aside the politics and reach an agreement and just commit ourselves to it. And from that moment on, and Chris Dodd was the lead negotiator on the Senate side, I was the lead negotiator on the Republican side, and then Barney, of course, was running the House side. Some of our colleagues from my side disappeared. But
fortunately,
on the House side.
Which is how something got done.
I never sensed there was any politics from that point on. There were big ideological questions we had to get over, but it was never an issue of politics. It was just, how are we going to do this? because the crisis was real. So I do think that the Congress would react again that way. I think the people who are in the Congress are fundamentally good people, and if confronted with a genuine crisis of the substantial nature that this was, I think you could still do so.
Barney, the mayor's nodding his head, and so are you.
Yeah, no, I disagree completely. First of all, remember that even then, with George Bush as president, the majority of the Republicans, even on the second vote, voted no.
Yeah.
Even after the stock market had done the worst thing, and all they did was yell at Paulson and yell at Kashkari, and they voted no. It's not just, I said the House Republicans did, right? But there's a difference.
It's a 100-foot walk for you the other way.
There's a difference between and by the way, it wasn't just the members of Congress. There was a great difference between the presidential candidates. And let's be very clear, we weren't stupid. We knew what was happening. The TARP will go down in history as the most highly successful, wildly unpopular thing the federal government has ever done. And we knew that going in. We didn't know how successful it would be, frankly. I think it worked out even better than we thought. But it was very clear. Because what you have, first of all, is the partisanship, but also there is a fundamental difference now between the House Republicans, not so much in the Senate, because it takes longer for a turnover in the Senate, and the Democrats, as to our belief in the function of government, as to our belief that government ought to be going forward. Right. And it's inconceivable that the House Republicans today would have responded in that way. It's partly more partisanship. It's partly the Democrats, frankly, believe more in government. That's one of the political disadvantages we've had at a time when people are anti-government. We're the pro-government party. But again, a majority of the House Republicans, even after the stock market fell by 700 plus points, still voted no the second time around.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Mr. Mayor, and then I want to bring Neel in.
Well, Judd, when we were in the room with Hank, in that side room off of the conference room, it was you, Hank, myself, and Barney. There were no House Republicans because they didn't actually believe in it. And Barney gives the document fact. First time it went up for a vote, majority of the House Republicans voted no. They had a 750-point drop in the market, and they still voted no. So I don't know what you think this Congress all of a sudden would be more amendable to a crisis than the Congress that prior to that, which showed, in fact,
it's partly partisanship and it's partly fundamentally ideological. Look, there were members of the Republican Party at the time who said, and I honor their integrity, yes, this could be a bad thing, but it's government intervention and I'm opposed to it. Right. And that ideological, I think, absolutism is even stronger in the House Republicans today, and it started to infect the Senate than before.
And George Bush gets credit for rising above the philosophy or ideology of his party to actually look out for the national interest.
Okay. Well, I think I'm not going to get too many words in here, and Neel will probably get none in. But I do believe...
Barney, I think that was directed at you, not at me.
I do believe that we are still governed by people who are genuinely committed to a better America. And if confronted with a crisis of extraordinary proportions, whether it's Pearl Harbor or whether it was basically the fiscal equivalent to Pearl Harbor, people will step up.
Right. Barney's looking on in horror, but hold that thought just for 1 second. Let me ask you this, Neel. You wrote
This is the last thing you'll be saying the whole thing.
That's okay.
No.
I just want to get to O'Hare in one piece.
Well, we're going to listen to every word you say now.
You worked on a document called the Break the Glass Plan in April of 2008, several months before we landed in the soup. And you met with Ben Bernanke, and you guys had a plan in place. It was close to what ultimately turned out to be the plan. Given that you saw it, or we'll give you credit for seeing that a problem was on the horizon, maybe not to the magnitude that you appreciated, I don't know. Do you think, if there was a lesson in this, that you could have, should have gone to Congress then? Maybe not for TARP, if you will, but for some ability to try to wind down a financial institution. Is the lesson in all this that you have to get there earlier?
You know, the problem is the politics, as my colleagues on the panel are talking about. We knew, go back, look at American history. Think of one example when our democracy has prevented a bad outcome. Our democracy is great at cleaning up a mess after it's happened. But think about climate change, how hard it is to get people to agree whether or not climate change exists, and if so, who should pay for preventing it. So the calculus for us was, when do you send the Treasury Secretary and the Chairman of the Fed to the Congress? Because they're going to have to go raise their right hands and say, if you don't give us this authority, we're going to be in the Great Depression. Now imagine the Treasury Secretary and the Fed Chairman go up, raise their right hands, they say that, and the Congress says no. That crisis of confidence, triggered by the very ask, could precipitate the crisis that we're trying to prevent. So our calculus was, we can only go to Congress when we have maximum chance that we're actually going to get the authority. And unfortunately, this was not a grand strategy, but unfortunately, it took a Lehman-type event to catalyze the Congress to act.
What were you going to say, Barney?
Well, just that Hank talks about this, and it's true. I was chairman of the Financial Services Committee. I just become the chairman in 2007. My Republican colleagues seem to forget that they ran the Congress until 2007. So 2003, 2004, I was in the minority, and Tom DeLay was not consulting me very regularly. But Hank talked about this, and my answer was, I don't think we could do it. Look, here's where we were. And as I said, it wasn't just partisanship on the part of the Republicans, Judd. There was a deep ideology on the part of many of these people, particularly on the Financial Services Committee. Jeb Hensling, who's now the chairman, a very honest, deeply conservative man. Scott Garrett. I spent much of 2008 defending Hank and Ben over Bear Stearns. They wanted to have hearings and drag them up there and denounce them over Bear Stearns. I mean, that was a hard enough thing to get done. There was no way, and I agreed with them intellectually, but there was no way that the kind of resolution procedure, et cetera, with a significant government intervention. Remember what we have in there. It says, hey, if things get bad, the government's going to take it over and we're going to put you in conservatorship. It would not have flown. And the reason is simple, and I want to add this, because we sometimes make the mistake of treating Washington as if it was somehow an autonomous bubble. It's driven by perceptions of voter sentiment. As I said, the TARP, great success, the voters hate it. We politicians leave a lot to be desired. The media makes me nuts, but the voters are no bargain either. And that should not be left out of the... And I used to say that when I was in office.
Barney had a quote, you may not think I'm so great, the constituents aren't so hot either. That's what Barney always used to say.
But here's the deal.
That's why we never let him near freshman members.
Here is you have this ideological opposition. I mean, it's a tremendous intervention by the government. You step in and you get rid of the board of directors and you fire people and you take the shareholders' money and you do all these things. And as I said, it was a hard enough job for me as chairman of the committee. I would never want to put to a vote the action by the Fed in being so active and having Bear Stearns be taken over. Right. It would have failed in committee.
Mr. Mayor, you famously have now said you never want a serious crisis to go to waste. I believe Christine Romer made a comment earlier. There's a big debate about who made that comment first, but I will give you the credit for it. There was someone in the audience who asked, A, what that meant when you said it, but B, I want to know...
I don't know, it sounded pithy.
Do you think, given the...
You got to cure that lisp.
Given that we are 5 years after... Given that we're 5 years after a financial crisis, given the frustration in the country, given the fact that Barney has now said that TARP may have been successful but deeply unpopular, did the crisis go to waste? Was there something that should have been done that wasn't?
Well, what I said, I made 2 points. Never allow a good crisis to go to waste. It's the opportunity to do big things that you otherwise would not have done. Now, we're here to talk about the financial crisis, but landing on the president's desk was also an auto crisis. In the transition, I remember when I went to go see President Bush and Josh Bolton, and they worked out, we're going to give $24 billion to the auto industry out of TARP, which was really only for the financial, and that gives the auto industry, that time GM, Chrysler, but given suppliers would have taken Ford with it, we're going to give them 6 weeks of running room, and that's all the runway they're going to get. And so now, bailing out the auto industry at that time was as unpopular as bailing out the financial sector. And we have all the data from the Obama administration, including Michigan. Hugely unpopular. Now, we've cleaned up their auto efficiency, which was delayed for 30 years. At 16 million cars produced a year, they were unprofitable. At 12 million, they're profitable now. And there are more people working in the auto industry writ large, including suppliers, today than when the crisis beforehand. So there's a crisis that you never allowed, and all the decisions that had to be made, from rationalizing suppliers, making sure that the financial community, as well as the organized labor, everybody had some skin in the game. Everybody had their hand, so to say, on the bloody knife. The auto industry today for America is a lot more competitive than it was pre the crisis. And that was a crisis that was used to resolve decades-long decisions that were deferred and delayed and finally made. So on the financial side, I think we're far better than where we were in the beginning. I think there are some things that still need to be done and constantly worked on. And I would include the auto industry, which is still much more economically competitive than it was before. And I'll give one example as being mayor. The Ford auto plant on the south side of the city of Chicago added a third shift, 1,200 jobs, another 900 as suppliers, and is the plant that exports to 67 countries out of that facility, more than any other Ford facility in the United States. That is a rebooted, retooled auto industry where the crisis forced a set of decisions you could not do without a crisis.
In retrospect, and I ask this of everybody on the panel, was there a way to make TARP more politically palatable? I don't know if it ever would be popular, but given that everybody on this panel, I think, suggests that TARP was a success, and I would argue the public does not.
No question.
What could have you done differently? Barney.
Well, I did have a bumper sticker that I thought about using in 2010, but I was persuaded not to. It said, "Things would have sucked worse without me." That was really the political slogan. That was true, but not helpful. Two things, but one that people think would have been helpful wouldn't have been. One argument, I thought Hank did a wonderful job, and I'm very proud of the work we did together in a bipartisan way. We had two disagreements. One was over whether initially to go after the salaries, the bonuses.
Compensation.
And I'll tell you, it probably wasn't controllable. The single biggest point when anger almost overwhelmed us was when the AIG bonuses were announced. The pitchforks, the mobs were out in the street with pitchforks. I mean, that was, I really worried about our capacity to govern. So I think we could have done more about that. The other one, and Hank felt that it was important to get the money out and you would burden this, but the second thing people have said, well, why didn't you do more to use some of that money for mortgage relief? Mm-hmm. And we had that argument. Again, I had helped sell this bill to Democrats, who were the ones we needed to pass it, by saying we would have mortgage relief. And again, I think the initial decision was we got to get this money out. Complicating it with an insistence that the banks do mortgage relief will slow down the recovery, a legitimate difference of opinion. So the first 350 went out without that. And I remember saying to Hank, I'm on the hook here, and it's good public policy. We need more money for mortgage relief. He then said, oh, well, as I remember, I will ask for the second tranche if Obama says, okay, this is now after the election. One of the things people should look at, political scientists should look at it, is the extent to which this was affected by the fact that some of the most important decisions ever taken by the American government were taken during a transition. And at that point, when I asked the Obama people, I said, all right, well, Paulson says he'll do it. Will you ask for it? And the response I got back was, well, we only have one president at a time. At that point, I was a little frustrated, and I said, I thought that overstated the number of presidents we had at that time. And I was chided by both. But but here's the deal. I wish we had done from the public policy standpoint more on mortgage relief. But people who think that was necessarily popular are wrong. Once again, there was a strong conservative argument. Hey, I pay my mortgage. Right. Why the hell are you taking money to give those people? Right. And look, there were some people who were victimized with subprime loans, and there were some people who bought a house, and then it went up in property, and they took out a home equity loan and bought a boat. And these were not proper objects of sympathy. So in the end, I don't think there was much we could have done to make it more popular.
Do both of you gentlemen disagree? You're nodding your heads. I think no.
Well, I think fundamentally what we had to do, there's a fundamental American belief of fairness. You take a risk, you bear the consequences of that risk. We had to violate that in order to save the economy. And when you violate a society's core beliefs, it leads to great anger. So the discussion of whether Congress today would be able to act, well, the fact that Congress is so polarized today, I think is actually a result of the actions that we had to take in 2008. So it's a little bit not a fair question to put the Congress in the position, because we created this by the actions that we had to take for the U.S. economy.
Mr. Mayor?
Two things. One, there's no way you can take a $750 billion bailout of the banks and make it popular. As somebody who practiced politics, not possible. That's not a dog that will hunt, to quote Bill Clinton. Not possible. It was ugly. It was going to stay ugly. No matter, I think everything, whether it was compensation, mortgages, was window dressing, it was fundamentally ugly, and you had to overwhelm the system politically because you thought the end goal was more important than the politics. That's just.
Can I just add one thing briefly? But in defense of Congress, this terrible vote was taken as close to an election as possible.
Right. That was my first. Yeah, exactly. And the other thing I would say is, I don't think this Congress is a reflection of those decisions. This Congress is a person who's also practices black arts and now is a reformer. And I say this about redistricting. The system is set up for the voters to pick your representatives. Through technology, representatives now pick their voters, and that's why you have a dysfunction in Congress. And it's turned the system upside down, and that's why it doesn't work.
Well, on this point, though, of what we could have done, first, we shouldn't have picked a four-letter word to be the acronym. Because it really, the term became a being of itself. It had no relationship to the actual legislative vehicle. The time frame was so condensed and the crisis was so acute, we didn't have the time to do the politics around the vote. But if we'd had the time, we could have made a pretty good case that the folks on Main Street were the ones that this was about. This wasn't about the banks. It was the fact that when you went to your business on Main Street, they weren't going to have enough money to open. And they weren't going to be able to, you weren't able to go down to your bank and get your money out because the bank would have been closed. But we weren't able to do that because we didn't have the time.
So here's then the question. This question's for Rahm. At the time,
I would like to give my time to Neel. He hasn't said anything.
We're going to come back in 1 second. At the time that the vote went down, I would argue that you and the president, or then senator, were very magnanimous about wanting to pursue TARP and support TARP. Having said that, when you talk about the popularity of TARP or not, there could be an argument made that later on, once the president became the president, he made a number of comments calling the bankers fat cats, making a number of comments that were somewhat prejudicial around TARP and around the recipients of TARP that have made that some people would argue made the program less popular. Do you buy that?
No.
Not at all.
No, I just said, if I said that, I wouldn't agree with what I said a minute ago, and at least I want to have some consistency for 3 minutes. The program was not popular. Now, first of all, I mean, Hank knows this. I mean, we are 2 months before an election. I'm a proud Democrat partisan. I put all what, quote unquote, my political aside on what I thought was, and Judd, you were there.
Absolutely.
And with Barney, we were the 2-point people for the House Democrats, trying to pass a bill with a national election and the entire House of Representatives up. So I didn't act in the sense of partisanship. I acted in the sense of that's right there.
I agree.
No, say that one more time.
I agree.
Thank you.
I disagree.
Now I just want to, but number two, the president also in his first speech to Congress said that if he needed to, but you forget this, said, well, you pointed out, sir, said he would ask for more money if it was necessary to do, not just on the TARP, additional, we had a big debate in the White House that we were at a point, given the stress tests and everything else, we may have needed more money. And what the market needed to hear at that point was that he was willing to go and get more money to stave off the need, which Neel has just talked earlier, of the need pre a crisis that you needed that. And if anything, he came to the aid and defense of the financial system as a whole, maybe not bankers. Bankers are not the financial system. Don't ever confuse the two. He was willing to do and spend political capital on a thing that was very unpopular and ask for additional resources and be necessary. And he did that in his first address to the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate, first address to the country. Now, the issue he brought up as it relates to compensation and bonuses was the very first issue when we first debating the department. He didn't say anything that hadn't been said by Democrats or Republicans prior to them.
Yeah, I think you have the cause and effect backwards. The question, I just saying you're just posing it as a question. The anger over the money being given to the banks was enormous. Remember, at the same time, a large number of people were losing their homes. Now, again, intervening to help people who were being foreclosed upon was a much more controversial issue than people thought. Because people said, don't give them money, they don't deserve it, and I'm paying my mortgage, and there's moral hazard. Should I stop paying my mortgage? And you're giving help only to people with 6 months in arrears, so why should I pay on time? But I think you had this. Here was Obama having defended this policy of giving. We knew it was a loan, but we couldn't be sure it was all going to be repaid at this point. Giving money to the people who had been part of the problem. And I think his criticism was partly a political necessity on his part. It was an effort to kind of drain off some of the anger he was getting. And I will say again, somebody ought to go and look at this, but I am sure in my own mind, I remember this clearly, we have two periods here. It's pre and post the AIG bonuses. You'll hear this from Chris later. Chris got very unfairly blamed because he tried to stop the AIG bonuses, but he was told you can't do it retroactively, so people accused him of allowing them. That is when all the anger really, I think, unleashed.
Okay. But whatever political demonization happened, whether it was necessary or not, my question, then I go to you, Neel, is this. When TARP was originally conceived, you thought the banks were going to keep the money for how long? The reason I ask the question is because they gave it back very, very quickly. Some people think that's a good thing, but clearly that was not part of the plan.
Yeah, our entire goal was to prevent the economy from collapsing. So we wanted to put as much capital in the financial system writ large as possible and have it sit there. So we designed it to be there for at least 3 years and then have them pay it back over time. The rules ended up being changed for political reasons. The pitchforks came out and they paid it back very quickly, which frankly was like a patient, giving the medicine back. You got to let the medicine work its way through the system. And so I think a lot of us were very concerned when the banks started paying back the TARP as quickly as they did. And that was in response to the politics.
And in criticism of the banks, and I got to say, the notion that these poor banks, that we hurt their feelings, all these very rich, very well-protected people, get over it. That's tough. I mean, I was appalled by their hypersensitivity, maybe because we're in a business where people say rude things about us all the time. But here's what I was told was that two of the things that we thought were necessary to alleviate public anger were one of the things that drove them. One, compensation restrictions. Mm-hmm. People wanted to be free of compensation restrictions. And two, they wanted the damned airplanes. I was struck by how much the ability to fly in your own plane meant to those people, and how the restrictions on being able to fly around was a problem. But it was also the political thing. But frankly, we who had voted for this, the president then who had supported it, the outgoing president too, and Rahm was right, it was a great moment on George Bush's part to defy his own party to some extent. But frankly, we were getting attacked too. It didn't occur to us to think, oh, these poor people were attacking them. But I also believe that it was nothing. This was not stimulated by the politicians. This was a genuine public anger.
But keep in mind though, one thing, in point of fairness, the House Republican leadership stepped up. I mean, John Boehner, Eric Cantor, Paul Ryan. I mean, you all are characterizing them.
They replaced their negotiator because they wanted to be participants.
They had no negotiator.
Yes, they did. They had Spence, and then they replaced him with Blunt. And Blunt came in.
But the point still is they still had a majority voting against it.
I understand. But, let's give some credit where it was due. And
well, I've got to say, in my experience, when the House leadership, the Republican House leadership really cares, they do better than a minority of their own party.
Right.
Well, I've got serious reservations about that characterization. I think a lot of people went to the floor on that Monday and voted no because they thought the leadership had the votes to pass the bill. And then they left the floor quickly, so they couldn't be gathered back in.
Those are the Republicans.
And I think that was true on both sides. By the way.
No, not so much. Look, the vote was
obviously not so much on your side.
No, that's a fundamental.
Nobody ever cast political votes on your side. But on our side, that occasionally
Judd, you're evading the central point.
On this one, Judd. No, wait a second.
Central point.
No, I'm sorry. Since it's politicians and it's about politics, and I know that may upset some people because we're only supposed to be talking about finances. Since you ask political questions, you're 2 months before an election. This is a freebie on the incumbent party. It's a free shot on goal without a goalie in the goal box. And the Democratic Party, with a majority, voted for it was not unpopular after the fact. It was unpopular when we debated. It was unpopular after it happened. It was unpopular when it was implemented. It was unpopular. And you can't put lipstick on that pig. It was unpopular and wouldn't stay unpopular.
Overwhelming partisan
and majority of our party voted for something with an incumbent president of the other party that would actually help solve a problem, and the majority of the Republican Congress voted against it, even with the president, their own president and party. Right. That is a very political vote 2 months before an election, and if you don't think that's true, you don't understand how the interaction of both economics and politics works.
Rahm, I'm just stunned that you're not a more forgiving person.
I am on a one-on-one basis, and I'm very forgiving to you.
Senator,
Because I was locked in a room with you for 48 hours.
okay, so but that's what I want you to do. Senator, take us just for a moment. Let's just talk about what happens with bipartisanship at midnight. Take us inside the room.
Wait, so can I say, Judd, you had your own view of your House colleagues where you know full well they were not acting, forget the leadership, they were not leading their members to a yes vote to defend the economy. And you had your own views then where you also realized they were not holding up their side of the bargain, even if some of them, like Roy Blunt, wanted to.
Well, I have plausible deniability on that issue.
Okay.
Senator,
We'll leave it there.
What I want you to do, just because I know the story, actually, it's in Hank's book, but maybe you can retell it for a second, which is you're in the room. It's close to midnight. I think you might be there too. I think Barney's there.
Barney was, and so was Rahm.
Actually, all of you. So all of you.
I would like the deniability now.
This was at sort of the crux. This was the moment. This whole thing was either going or was not going.
Yeah. In my opinion.
And this man, Mr. Paulson, I think was actually throwing up. He was so anxious about what was happening.
Well, he was concerned.
Yes.
And Rahm and I were with Hank in an anteroom.
Yep.
And then Rahm and I went in with Barney, and the last issue was restitution. And Secretary and I had made a proposal. Secretary had made a proposal. He was in charge. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we'd been going back and forth on this constantly, and Neel was very active on this. And finally, about 12 o'clock, we couldn't reach an agreement, and we were throwing up our hands. And it was just the three of us in the room. And I remember Rahm specifically saying, okay, and you and Rahm went in to see the speaker. And I don't think this story's really been told. And I thought it was over. I thought we'd lost it. And we all knew we had to have the deal that night because the Asian markets were opening the next day and everything went down if we didn't have a deal. And about 10 minutes later, the speaker came out and looked at me and said, we're going your way. It's done. It's over. The deal's done. I don't think the speaker's ever gotten credit for that. I don't know what happened in that room, but believe me, if she had not done that, there would have been no deal. And she's never gotten credit for it.
Barney.
For that reason,
Yeah, by the way-
Gregg's flight's going to leave on time today.
Let me go back a step, too, by the way, in terms of, and there is a fundamental difference, and it is, I think, not just partisan. I want to stress this again. The difference between the two parties has been, there's been a movement in the Republican Party from the kind of mainstream conservatism of you, of Bob Dole, of both Presidents Bush, to a group that does not accept the notion that the public sector must play a significant role. Our parties, at their best, we know that there should be a public sector and a private sector, and we fight about where to draw the line.
But that's not the majority of our party. That may be a loud function of our party, but it's not the majority.
It is the part of the party that has intimidated the rest of the party in the House. I agree with that. But I think it's the perception of many House Republicans that's where the primary voters would turn out if there was a primary. And that was well, then why you just saw that happen.
But you also saw the speaker take it to the floor. And
after a great deal of crisis, after a lot of, he took it to the floor when the gun was at his head.
Pretty big.
The gun was at his head.
Anyway,
no, you brought it up, Jim. The fact is that he acted only.
I don't want to get us off on too much of a tangent of
No, it's not a tangent.
politics.
I'm sorry, this is not a tangent. This is not a small thing. I think you have a serious problem going forward in the extent to which a group of Republicans in the House who do not accept the legitimacy of the function of the government have the degree of influence that they have, and I think that was a factor. That's very much it. As far as Nancy Pelosi is concerned, her cooperation started earlier. In 2008, in January, George Bush came to us and said, we need an economic stimulus because the economy's in trouble. Now, a partisan response would have been, economy's in trouble, it's an election year, let it go slip. And Pelosi not only agreed to that, but she came back to us and said, look, we need a stimulus for the economy. The Republicans won't support spending. There have to be tax cuts. So I'm going to say yes, but it will be the most progressive tax cuts we can with earned income tax credits, et cetera. But there is a fundamental difference between the two parties today, given the influence of the Tea Party, on the sense of how much you sacrifice of your own views to keep the government going. And I think within the Republican Party in the House today, there has been a scary diminution of that commitment.
It's not the majority position of the House members.
At the risk of not making my flight, you're absolving the president's role in building those bridges to the Congress. There are lots that's changed since 2008.
No, I'm not. Let me say this. George Bush and I were not pals. I never had any serious conversation with George Bush. But when he sent Paulson and Bernanke up to tell us that things were collapsing, we responded. And it wasn't based on any schmoozing of me and George Bush.
Okay, I have two more questions, and I want to open it up to the audience. I'm going to go to you, Barney, on this. On
already
Wall
went to
Street,
Barney.
Excuse me?
We already went to Barney.
We've already gone to Barney, but I'm going to start with him, and we'll go down the line.
Barney borrowed some of my time.
And you're very generous with that time.
He is my former chairman, so I have to be.
J.P. Morgan is in the midst of this $13 billion settlement, in part related to assets that it acquired during the financial crisis, both Bear Stearns and Washington Mutual. You have said publicly, and I'm curious if your view has changed since we last talked, given details that have emerged, about whether you think the government should be fining the company for buying those, or not for buying those assets, but for whatever sins happened to those assets that were purchased during the crisis with a little bit of push, if not a lot of bit of push, from
No, my view
Mr.
hasn't
Paulson.
changed. It's been refined. I've got more facts. I would say this. First of all, to my recollection, the Washington Mutual and Bear Stearns were not the same. There was much more voluntary activity on the part of J.P. Morgan Chase for Washington Mutual. So Washington, and similar with Bank of America. Bank of America was pushed into taking Merrill Lynch. Buying Countrywide was one of the worst ideas Ken Lewis ever had, and it was his idea. No one told him to do it. So I differentiate. With regard to WAMU, no, that's totally there. With regard to Bear Stearns, no, specifically use the word fine. I think it would be not just unfair, but bad public policy to fine them for having acquiesced to serious pressure from the federal financial people to take over Bear Stearns. Leave aside equity. I can't rule out that sometime, some place in the future, there will be a request by other federal financial officials to a bank to step in that way. And they would, I think, much less likely now to be cooperative. To the extent that you could say, well, there's some people to be made whole because of some things Bear Stearns did, that's different. But as far as fining them, penalizing them because of what Bear Stearns did before they were pressured into accepting it, I think that's a mistake.
Right. Mr. Mayor, what do you think of that? Do you think the next time the Treasury Secretary calls a bank during a time of crisis, do they hang up on him?
Well, I don't know what they would do. I can't speak to that. I do think, I want to emphasize what Barney just said. On this one part of, which I think is an important point. We're at a place, and I remember that J.P. Morgan had to get Bear Stearns because you would have had the Lehman moment earlier. Now to have J.P. Morgan, because they actually did something they didn't initiate, we solicited them to do. Now we're holding them legally responsible for what we asked them to do at that time. So on that piece of the settlement, I don't know how much it specifically represents. I think you're basically being able, the government's being given a position to look back and rewrite the rules of what actually contextually happened in a way and bearing people responsibility, when actually they didn't come forward with the idea of buying Bear Stearns and absorbing it. We brought it to them, asked them to do it, and now we're saying you're legally culpable for it. That's a double jeopardy.
Right. Okay, final question, 30 seconds for each, and then we'll go to the audience. If each of you individually could have done one thing different during the crisis, either before, after, during, I don't care, individually on your own, what would it have been? We'll start here.
I've thought about this a lot. I think the communications was the hardest thing that we struggled with because we had, the way I describe it, we had one microphone, but we had two different audiences. We wanted to project confidence to the markets, but we wanted to let the Congress know how terrified we really were. And honestly, to try to catalyze them to move. But if we let the markets know how terrified we were, it would have been destabilizing. And so we ended up with a muddled message. I don't have a good answer for how to solve that, but maybe better communication with the Congress so that they could know confidentially how terrified we were. Maybe that would have made the political process a little bit easier.
Rahm?
I mean, I haven't really thought about it. I've had my time full with some things right in front of me. That said, actually sitting here and sitting on the panel, I don't know if this would have worked, but maybe forcing the Republican House members to put somebody in the room with us so they would have had more ownership of the final product. May have changed the context of the vote. I still don't even believe if you change the context of the vote, this would have been popular and publicly accepted. They don't like bailing out people for decisions they've had to make.
Right. Judd?
I have to be honest. I think that for my part in my role and where I was asked to do it, which was minor in the sense that I was just carrying Senate Republican water, it was a team effort. And I was genuinely, I don't think there's ever been a time in my experience in government. When I was governor, we had some extraordinarily difficult times. 5 of our 7 largest banks failed, for example. I don't think I ever saw a period when people worked so conscientiously together on both sides. I mean, I think it was one of the most impressively positive points in American history.
We actually got a friendship out of it.
Yeah,
That's right.
No, we do. I mean, I'd say that, I mean, we tease each other and all that. We got a friendship out of it because we were locked in a room for a long time and learned a lot about each other and trust.
let me say, I agree with Judd, and I want to make one very important point, because these people claiming now, oh, bipartisanship, it's broken down. Yeah, there's that problem, but it's not systemic, because we are talking not about 1920. We're talking about 5 years ago, in very difficult times, our structure of government worked very well. I think the problems have been political. Secondly, though, what I would have done, and here's one point I wanted to make, one of the things people don't understand are the limitations of being in the legislature. You cannot lead from the legislature. You know, and it's partly political. Give you a football analogy. The best blocker in the world who protects his quarterback is not going to get the attention of the guy who leads the league in sacks. If you're in the legislature, there is an incentive to be on the attack, because if you're being supportive, the executive gets credit. So that's a lead up to saying this. I regret not having fought harder for more mortgage relief in the beginning, not so much to make it politically acceptable, but I do believe that the lack of mortgage relief became an economic drag on the economy, that was a problem. But I will say the reason I didn't was this. You have 2 choices at some point when you're in the legislative branch. You say yes or no. You can't say yes only if. Mm-hmm. And my conviction was that I pushed as hard as I could, but I couldn't pull the trigger of saying no. So that's my answer.
Thank you, Barney. Thank you to the panel.
Can I say one thing?
Yes, sir.
There's a historic moment. Barney used a sports metaphor. I think I've never heard that in all the time I served with him, Barney.
Okay, on that note, we're going to open it up to the audience. I see a hand right here with the bow tie in the front. And same rules apply. Please stand, state your name, and as David Wessel said, the question should end with a question mark.
Hi, my name is Eric Wessam. I'm a 4th year at the University of Chicago. I was wondering, I know that while there are 435 members, voting members of Congress and 100 senators, not all of them are experts in economics. And I was wondering what sort of impact that has on any sort of discussion concerning the economy as a whole, and how much that hinders effective policy.
Well, you know, I want to speak to that quickly, because the other panel was alluding to this. Mr. Schwab alluded to it. I don't think most people in Congress knew this was coming. I generally don't think within my caucus in the Senate that anybody was thinking this was coming. There was just a sort of, well, we're doing business as business works, and people just suddenly woke up and this was on top of them. It was a fascinating situation. Some of us who were involved had been talking a little bit about it, but nobody saw it coming in the Congress.
I agree, yeah. The reason was, to some extent, you couldn't alert people that it was coming without bringing it on further. You were in that dilemma where you couldn't.
Well, that was Neel's point.
You couldn't talk about it. But to answer the question directly, the way Congress usually works is there is deference to experts. There are only a small number of experts on any issue. And basically what you do if you're a member of Congress is, as you get there, you figure out who are the people whose judgment you trust, whose values are generally your values in terms of goals, and then you follow them on the issues where they are experts. And that is, I think, often the case economically as well. The situation here was this transcended that. This all of a sudden broke through it. But that's generally what happens is on each side there are people who have the degree of expertise, and they basically call the shots, and the other members tend to follow.
Mr. Mayor.
2 quick points. The House is set up to be specialist based on your committee assignments, and the Senate is generalist. They don't have the same kind of distinction, and I think that there's, to echo what Barney just said, there's going to be a few people colleagues are going to turn to for their judgment and background. Nobody's, the background of, and I will just say also this, there were not a lot of people even outside Congress that had an experience with a major financial meltdown. Our most recent experience as a country was a sector called the savings and loan industry, not mutual funds, banks, investment banks, the entire financial system, and insurance companies. So the idea that just in Congress, the expertise, we didn't really have it in the country. It didn't exist. We were making it, let's be honest, guys, we were making it up as we were going on the seat of our pants. And that was true for us in Congress, the administration, as well as experts outside who were commenting. And for all that, we did pretty well.
There's a question right there, sir.
Carl Tannenbaum, Chief Economist here at the Northern Trust. The early editions of TARP were relatively short on specifics. If memory serves, it was a relatively brief document with a very large number in it. I have a question. First, politically, as approval was contemplated, was this lack of detail one of the reasons why getting to consensus was difficult? And then one of the pivotal moments, I think, as we think back on TARP, was that it had been intended, first, to purchase bad assets out of the banks and find investors behind them, and then it pivoted to being a bank recapitalization tool. At what point was that decision made, on what basis? Because it ended up being very, very important.
Well, take us inside the room.
Sure. Well, both points. So first of all, the original bill was 3 pages, but that was never intended to be a full bill. That was a description of the authorities that we needed. So we sent it to the Congress to say, here are the authorities we need. Now let's go craft a bill. Obviously, the interpretation of that, especially in the press, was this was the full bill, and it was never intended to be the full bill. In terms of the pivot from buying assets to investing equity, in the Congress moved in lightning speed just 2 weeks from when we asked for the authority to ultimately when we got it, which is extraordinary. But in those 2 weeks, markets cratered from beneath our legs. And we literally went in there intending to buy the assets, but as the markets collapsed beneath us, we just had to move much, much faster, and that's why we made the change. But to our credit and to the Congress's credit, we designed the authority to be broad enough that we could make those kind of decisions if we had to without having to go back.
Yeah, there was some consensus there. You mentioned Spencer Backus. He gets some credit for this. In the meeting, he was a senior Republican, leader of the Republican minority at the time. And when it was presented as buying up the assets, he was one of the first in our meeting to raise the notion of, well, how about a capital infusion? And so there was a consensus, no fight. Let's give the secretary the authority to do whichever, either, both, some mix. So that did grow out of the deliberations in that room. We also said there was a necessity to do something about compensation. Jack Reed in the Senate talked about the need for some kind of repayment. And there was general agreement that we needed some of these. The compensation thing became a little bit controversial. But the notion of going from buying the assets to capital infusion grew out of a conversation, and there was general agreement. We don't know what the hell's going to happen. Let's give him the authority to do what makes the most sense. And there was no criticism that I recall when he decided. And when was the decision made, as I recall, after the bill had been passed and the secretary had the authority?
When it shifted gears from a 3-page document to a very long document was when a decision was made to mark up from the Senate bill. That was made Thursday morning. It was a big mistake, but that's the way folks wanted to go forward. So we spent most of Thursday trying to clean out the Senate bill. As to the flexibility, as I recall, the only thing that Secretary Paulson asked of our side in the Senate in the negotiation was he wanted 2 things. He wanted a lot of money, and he wanted total flexibility. So that was our, those were the standards we were told to fight for.
Okay, we're going to squeeze in a couple more questions. You have the mic there.
Hi, my name is Ari Tandler. I'm a second year in the college majoring in economics and political science. And my question is, in the past when there have been historical problems and solutions that have come up and been updated into ideology that are now regarded as facts, such as, worked for Ronald Reagan, it'll work now. How do you reconcile these past competing ideologies into making a plan that is both current and can help resolve the current crisis and that can pass through the government?
Who wants to take
Well, I'm glad to get that question. I'm very troubled right now that we're not doing that. I mentioned this maybe a little off topic, but I am about to submit a comment to the regulators dealing with residential mortgages, very much opposing what appears to be their major proposal. We talked about this before. They are in the process, it looks like, of their favorite proposal is one that would effectively do away with risk retention in home mortgages and allow 100% securitization. We set up 3 categories of mortgages. Lousy ones that no one should make, and we made it pretty much impossible to make them. The great majority, which you should make and keep 5% of the risk if you're going to securitize them, and then super duper ones that are sure to be repaid, that have no risk retention. They've collapsed the two. And so I think the question is, I am surprised at how quickly people have, in my judgment, forgotten what was one of the major causes. And I just am somewhat disappointed, I'm hoping that they're going to change this. So the answer is there's no sure guide against this. People, there's a lot of political pressure there. By the way, both from the banks and from the low-income advocacy groups. They are channeling a Wall Street Journal editorial of a few years ago that attacked me for cutting back on subprime loans because I was keeping poor people from buying houses. That sentiment is I am afraid, recurring. So my answer to you is we haven't found a way yet, I think, to do that effectively.
Sir.
Ken Monahan. Neel mentioned at the beginning of this that American democracy is very good at fixing problems, but not very good at heading them off. And the preceding panel talked a lot about the issues of government involvement in the mortgage industry that are sort of ongoing. Can you think of, like, broadly, is it a constitutional issue? Like, how should the government go about trying to address the things that it knows that are on the horizon now, having learned what it just learned from, not failing to sort of head off this thing? Is it possible, or are we just doomed to keep doing this?
I mean, my view is that human civilizations are prone to mass delusion. So literally, I mean, it's funny, but it's not funny. I bought a house in California in 2005. I didn't see the housing bubble coming. And I think if Alan Greenspan, then chairman of the Federal Reserve, in 2005 had said, we have a housing bubble, I'm going to clamp down on mortgage lending, the members of my panel up here would have been outraged that their members are being kept from participating in the American dream. And first-time homeowners would have been outraged. And so it's very hard for one omniscient person to see something when the rest, nobody else sees it. And so, unfortunately, we have to do our very best, but human history is full of financial crises because as a society, we are prone to delusion. And unfortunately, it's probably going to happen again.
Rahm?
Yeah. Let me say, I don't think, to your question, take two events. In 1983, there was 3 months left to the Social Security Trust Fund being able to pay. It took the 3-month window to force a set of decisions that Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill and Baker worked out. Judd said something which is true at one level, but I would disagree, which is more time to explain the TARP, et cetera. I don't think our Congress, regardless of who got blamed, who voted, with more time would have been more thoughtful. And in fact, you needed that crisis moment to move. Take a look at infrastructure, basic research, or immigration. I think we would all three, maybe there's a consensus there, maybe there isn't, that all of those are in our own economic self-interest immediately and long-term. How are we doing at resolving them? So you need a kind of a moment to crystallize and force an action that when you're being thoughtful, you can see it in front of you, but you can't do it. That, unfortunately, is how the political system works. Now, on the other hand, this does get to what Barney did say, and while I joked a little, but it's serious. You're not going to get leadership out of the legislative branch. They're very good at corralling votes and so on. Leadership comes out of the executive branch that provides a roadmap, a direction, sets goals that the legislative then run and move move people towards the barn door. And that is how the process works. And creating that moment is part of what leadership out of the executive branch can create to actually come up with solutions a little ahead of the schedule.
One sentence, by the way, in defense of democracy, I don't see non-democracies doing all that much better in anticipating problems either. I wouldn't blame democracy. I would blame lack of human foresight and the ability to be sure about what's going to happen with complex acts.
Okay, we're almost out of time. Diane Swank, you may get the final question. We'll see.
Okay, really quickly, I just wondered, Neel, you made the point about needing to invoke confidence in financial markets and terror in Congress. Is maybe that lack of messaging that didn't happen then part of the problem today in terms of gridlock and what it's costing our economy today?
Well, I think the situation is, we're not at we talked about this earlier, we're not at the crises that we're facing right now are self-inflicted. They're created by political dysfunction. And so I think the situation is fundamentally different today. But I share Judd, ultimately I share his optimism that I think if there were a national crisis, a real crisis, you would see people come together and you would see Congress act in a much more rational manner.
We have a final question right over here.
I'll be quick. Stuart Lucas. How do we create the political circumstances to reset redistricting to a point you guys were raising earlier?
Mr. Mayor?
Well, you look at California, you look at Arizona, Iowa. You take it out of the legislative body. You got to do what if you think my analysis is right about what the problem is, that's the first question. I happen to think it. Then what you have to do is, where it has succeeded, California is an example, Arizona is an example, Iowa, where you bring competition back.
Referendums.
Right, yes.
Referenda.
You got to basically take the state legislators out and put it into a kind of a court/nonpartisan analysis, and that's what I would do.
Before we go, because I see you have your paper there, Barney, I'm going to tee this up for you.
Thank you.
Do you want me to tee it up for you or just want to go?
No, you tee it up.
You are about to go to the, is this going to the floor?
No, I can't.
You can't go to the floor anymore.
I can go to the floor, but I can't talk, so the hell with that.
You are about to release a paper.
Yeah, I'm submitting it. It is an official comment on a pending regulation before the administrative agencies, the 5 agencies that are charged in the statute with dealing with the question of risk retention in residential mortgages.
And that's going on today.
The deadline is tomorrow.
And do you want to tell everybody briefly what the paper says?
In the legislation, we, in the first place, banned the bad kind of mortgages, for which, by the way, I was attacked in the Wall Street Journal. I have to remind people that in November 6, 2007, they said I was keeping poor people from buying houses because subprime loans were fine. Then we said those loans you couldn't have.
That was paraphrased?
No, that's exactly right. Judd, you can read it.
He's got copies for everybody.
I got copies. Secondly, we said for the great bulk of mortgages, they were called qualified mortgages. For those mortgages, you would be able to securitize them, but we asked for risk retention, that 5% of the risk would have to be retained by the securitizer, which would presumably incentivize them not to buy junk. Then, frankly, because of a couple of senators, Democrats, who were listening to people in the mortgage industry, we put in a potential exception called a qualified residential mortgage. Stupidly confusing, QM and QRM. And those qualified residential mortgages were supposed to be a super duper safe category which you could securitize without risk retention. To my dismay, the major proposal of the 5 regulators is to condense the two, to combine the two, and to have only one set of mortgages, one you can't make, and the other that you can make without risk retention of any case. You heard that before the panel. I think this has been the single biggest cause of the problem, and I am hoping that they can be dissuaded and have risk retention as a rule. And the argument is, people can't, they don't know how to make mortgages without risk retention, without 100% securitization, which apparently means no mortgages were made in America before about 1980 when that came in.
Okay. We're going to leave it there. Let me just say selfishly that this has been a remarkable treat. Thank you so much for the conversation. Thank you for the questions.
You got to read this.
Barney Frank, Judd Gregg, the mayor, Neel Kashkari. Thank you. Thank you.